Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The atmospheric processors on Helix Corridor Station had been producing a sound for 11 days that Davin Rays could only describe as thoughtful. Not broken. Broken had a different register entirely, a kind of percussive urgency that got you out of bed at odd hours and kept you there. But thoughtful, the way a person sounds when they're working something out just below the level of speech. It hummed through the walls of the Environmental Integration Division's main workspace, at a frequency that the diagnostic array insisted was within acceptable parameters, and that Davin's spine, which he trusted considerably more than the diagnostic array, insisted was not. He had filed 3 reports about it. The first had been acknowledged. The second had generated an automated response informing him that his concern had been logged and would be reviewed within 30 standard days, which was the administrative equivalent of being patted on the head. The third had disappeared entirely, which he had come to understand was actually a promotion of sorts. Only the reports that genuinely worried someone tended to vanish. He was reading the morning's atmospheric composition data when the allocation notice arrived, sliding into his inbox between a reminder about mandatory hull integrity training that he had been rescheduling for 4 months, and a message from the hydroponic sublevel informing him that Bay 7's irrigation calibration was, and this was the word the technician had chosen, philosophically misaligned. He read the allocation notice twice. Then he read it a third time, not because it was complicated, but because it was the kind of document that rewarded suspicion. 1 additional team member, general support staff. Effective immediately. Deployment history, restricted. Origin coding, restricted. Previous divisional assessments, restricted. The name field, which was the only part of the file that hadn't been quietly excised, said simply, Sale. Breck appeared at his shoulder with the practiced silence of a being whose species had evolved in an environment where making noise prematurely had consequences. He was reading the notice before Davin had consciously registered his presence, which was normal. Breck's relationship with personal space was theoretical. General support staff, Breck said, in the precise, unhurried tone he used for statements that were doing considerably more work than they appeared to. That classification is what the system produces when someone wants the system to stop asking questions. That's a specific interpretation. It is the correct interpretation. I have seen this classification applied 4 times in my career. Once to a structural engineer whose credentials were being disputed in an interstation legal proceeding. Once to a former government attaché on administrative reassignment. Once to a very confused botanist who had accidentally filed her own paperwork under the wrong species designation and spent 3 weeks classified as a non-sapient organism before anyone noticed. Davin looked up from the screen, and the 4th time. Breck was quiet for a moment in the way that contained an entire editorial. The 4th time I did not ask, he said, and returned to his station. The atmospheric processor continued its low, meditative hum. Davin flagged the allocation notice as received, made a note to pull Bay 7's irrigation logs before the end of shift, and went back to his composition data, which was showing a fractional elevation in the nitrogen-oxygen ratio on the corridor C7 level that probably meant nothing, and that he would worry about anyway because that was the nature of the work, and increasingly, the nature of Davin Rays. She arrived the following morning at the precise start of the shift, which told him something. People who arrive exactly on time to new postings are either very conscientious or very practiced at being observed. She came through the corridor access point carrying a single equipment bag, the kind of bag that spoke of a life organized around the possibility of departure. And she stopped at the threshold of the main workspace with a stillness so complete it had its own quality, like a room after sound has left it. He registered her in pieces, the way you register anything that briefly disrupts your certainty about what you're looking at. She was, on first assessment, human, the proportions right, the face structured along lines that the brain accepts without effort. But there was something in the quality of her skin, a faint luminescence beneath the surface that didn't announce itself so much as imply itself, present only at the periphery of attention, the kind of thing you noticed when you were not trying to notice it. Her eyes were dark and fractionally too large, ringed at the outer iris with a thin band of pale gold that held the light differently than the rest of her face. Her hair fell dark to her shoulders, and when she moved it followed with a delay, a half-breath behind the rest of her, as though it was perpetually composing a more considered response. She introduced herself in the voice of someone who has said their name many times to people who needed it only for the record. She was Sale. She had been allocated as general support. She was prepared to begin immediately with whatever the division required. Davin set down his coffee, which was the temperature it always was by the time he remembered to drink it, which was too cold. He looked at her, not the quick cataloging glance of a supervisor assessing a new resource, but actual attention, the kind that settles rather than scans. "Good," he said. "But before we get to any of that, where have you worked before?" "Not for the file. I'll read the file. I mean, what kind of work have you actually done, and what are you good at? And what have people asked you to do that you were technically willing to do but that wasted your time?" The light changed on her skin. Just briefly, a shift in the undertone, something warm moving through it before it stilled. She looked at him the way people look at a door they have assumed is locked when the handle moves. Behind them, 12 meters away, Breck was reviewing the nitrogen-oxygen anomaly on Corridor C7. He was also, with the peripheral awareness his species maintained as a matter of biological habit, observing the exchange at the entrance with considerable interest and updating several of his working assumptions simultaneously. He said nothing. He filed the data carefully. He decided this was going to require a new column in his model, and he was not yet sure what to label it. She answered his questions the way someone crosses a room they are not certain will hold their weight, each step placed with care, testing before committing. She had worked atmospheric systems, she said. Environmental monitoring, some hydroponic maintenance, systems analysis at the level the work required. She learned quickly. She made few errors. Her voice carried these facts with the flatness of someone reciting what is true without revealing why it is true. And Davin listened in the way he listened to the processors, not just to the sound, but to what the sound was covering. He did not push. He showed her the division instead. The environmental integration workspace occupied a long, low-ceilinged section of the station's mid-ring, a stretch of corridor and adjoining bays that smelled perpetually of hydroponic nutrient solution and the particular metallic undertone of recycled atmosphere. It was not a beautiful space. It was a space that worked, which Davin had come to regard as a higher category. He walked her through it without performance. The monitoring arrays, the atmospheric relay banks, the hydroponic sublevels where Bay 7's irrigation system was still, according to the technician's most recent message, engaged in what he had now upgraded to an existential recalibration. He explained what each system did, why it mattered, what failure looked like before it announced itself. He spoke about it the way people speak about things they actually care about, which is to say, without trying to seem like they care about it. Sale asked questions, not the questions of someone establishing competence, look how much I know, but the questions of someone building a real picture. Why was the CO2 scrubber on the C-ring running at 93% rather than optimizing to full? Had the hydroponic irrigation anomaly been cross-referenced with the atmospheric mix data, or were they being treated as separate events? Davin stopped walking when she asked the second question. He turned and looked at her with the expression of someone who has been reading a document and suddenly noticed a sentence they should have caught earlier. "I've been treating them as separate events," he said. "They might not be," she said, in the careful voice of someone who is not yet sure they're allowed to say the thing they're saying. He pulled the data that afternoon. She was right. The problem was not dramatic. It never was in this kind of work. The dramatic problems were the ones that had already become emergencies. But it was real, and it was the sort of thing that compounded quietly over weeks until it was no longer quiet. A fractional variance in the atmospheric nitrogen mix on the sea ring was affecting the moisture uptake in Bay 7's irrigation matrix in a way that neither system's alert threshold was calibrated to detect, because the alert thresholds had been set by someone who had modeled each system in isolation. The fix was methodical. It took 3 hours, one recalibration sequence, and a brief argument with the Bay 7 interface panel, which Davin had never trusted and which seemed to return the feeling. When it was done, Davin logged the diagnostic finding with Sale's name attached to the insight. He did this without ceremony, the way he did everything administrative, accurately, because accuracy was the point of doing it at all. Sale watched him submit the log and said nothing. Her skin did something brief and amber in the light of the display screen, there and then controlled back to neutral. And Davin did not notice because he was already pulling the next set of atmospheric readings and thinking about the searing levels. And this was one of the things about him that Breck had cataloged as both his most useful quality and his most reliable liability. Breck, for his part, had been updating his working assumptions about Sale since approximately 9 minutes into her first shift. The update process had not been comfortable. Breck's models were precise instruments, and he disliked introducing variables that required the reconfiguration of existing categories rather than simply adding a new row. Sale required reconfiguration. Her knowledge of the atmospheric system was not the patchy familiarity of general support staff who had been handed a manual. It was structural, the kind that came from understanding why systems were built the way they were rather than simply how to operate them. She caught herself twice in the first week, pulled back from a technical fluency that exceeded what her file described, and the corrections were smooth enough that a human supervisor would have missed them entirely. Breck was Korathi, which meant that his peripheral processing ran on a parallel track to his primary attention, a biological arrangement his species had developed in environments where missing things had immediate consequences. He missed nothing. He said nothing. He was running a longer calculation. The humor in the division's daily life emerged primarily from the equipment which had opinions. The atmospheric relay bank on the west wall had developed a response delay of approximately 4 seconds, meaning that any adjustment made to the system visually took effect immediately and audibly confirmed itself 4 seconds later, which produced the persistent impression that the station was commenting on your decisions after brief reflection. The Bay 7 panel, having been recalibrated, began producing readings that were correct, but that displayed with a font size inexplicably 40% larger than every other panel in the sublevel, so that the carbon dioxide content of Bay 7 read like a headline. Davin submitted a maintenance request about the font. The maintenance system acknowledged receipt, assigned it a priority level of 4, and sent him an automated follow-up asking if the situation had resolved itself. He replied that it had not. The system responded by upgrading it to priority 3 and asking if perhaps he had tried recalibrating the display. He had. The font remained emphatic. By the end of the second week, Sale had established herself in the division the way certain kinds of weather establish themselves, not suddenly but thoroughly, so that by the time you thought to name it, it had been there for some time. She arrived exactly on time and left when the work was finished rather than when the shift was technically over, which was also when Davin left. And on the third occasion this happened, they ended up walking back through the amber-lit corridor together in the particular companionable silence of people who have spent the day solving things and are content to let the day be what it was. Davin said, without planning to, that he'd grown up on a planet with severe atmospheric instability, seasonal pressure variances that the population had adapted to over generations, but that visitors found disorienting. He'd spent his childhood paying attention to the air in the specific way you pay attention to things that are trying to tell you something. Sale was quiet for several steps. Then she said that she understood paying attention to things other people didn't notice because they assumed someone else was watching. He didn't ask her to elaborate. It didn't feel like the moment for it. They walked through the blue-hour light of the pre-cycle corridor, and the atmospheric processor somewhere in the wall produced its low, considering hum, and Davin made a mental note to check the searing readings again in the morning. And Sale looked at the corridor ahead of them with the expression of someone recalculating a distance they had assumed they knew. The station ran a simulated night cycle that nobody had asked for, and nobody had figured out how to turn off. At 21:00 station time, the corridor lights shifted from amber to a deep blue that the original environmental designers had apparently intended to be calming, and that most of the station's residents found either melancholy or vaguely accusatory, depending on their relationship with the hour. In her quarters in the blue-hour dark, Sale let the bioluminescence move. She did this every night. It was the only time she did it. In the 12 hours between end of shift and the return to work, she allowed her skin to cycle through what it was actually doing rather than what she had learned to maintain, the careful neutral that read as human in dim light and as almost human in any other. Alone, it moved. Amber when she was thinking, which was most of the time. A deep, slow green when she was tired. The violet that she did not have a clean word for in any language she spoke, which came when she thought about her brother and where he might be and whether the station he'd been assigned to had windows. She thought about her father less, which she had decided was not a failure of love but a necessary economy. Corin Veason had been a man who believed that systems, properly maintained, served the people within them. He had spent 20 years inside a governing structure working to make this true, and when the coalition collapsed and the new administration began its reorganization of everyone who constituted institutional memory, his belief had not protected him and had not protected any of them. What it had left her, she had come to understand, was the habit of paying close attention to how systems actually functioned versus how they were described as functioning, which was perhaps the most useful inheritance he could have offered, and was not the one either of them would have chosen. Her quarters were sparse. Not ascetic, she had not romanticized the exile, but unencumbered, the way spaces become when their occupant has moved enough times to understand the relationship between attachment and weight. There was one item on the shelf above the narrow sleeping platform that was not standard station issue. A pressed fragment of leaf from a tree that grew on the second continent of a world she had not been permitted to return to, sealed in a preservation case so thin it was almost not there. She did not look at it often. It was enough to know it was present. She was reviewing the CO2 calibration data from Base 7, reading it on her personal pad, which was habit, a kind of work that settled the mind before sleep, when her internal accounting of the day produced, as it always did, the quiet audit of what she had said and not said and nearly said and caught herself before saying. The atmospheric cross-reference. The irrigation matrix analysis. The moment in the afternoon when Davin had been describing the relay bank recalibration protocol, and she had begun to respond with a theoretical framework that belonged to a third-year environmental science curriculum, and had redirected herself into simpler language a half-second before the sentence completed. He hadn't noticed. He was already thinking about the data, the way he was always already thinking about the data, which was a quality she had initially categorized as inattentiveness and had since recategorized as a form of respect. He was not watching her for what she might reveal. He was thinking about the work they were doing together. This was, she had concluded, either very safe or very dangerous, and she had not yet determined which. Breck had noticed. She was certain of this the way she was certain of most things she had not been directly told, through the particular quality of his not noticing, which was too precise to be genuine. Breck's inattention was a performed instrument. She recognized the technique because she had been using a version of it herself for 3 years. She had not decided what to do about Breck yet. She filed this under ongoing. The commendation form arrived in Davin's inbox on a Wednesday, which he later said explained a great deal. The station's administrative system had processed his efficiency logs, cross-referenced them with the divisional output metrics for the previous month, detected a statistically significant improvement in diagnostic accuracy, and concluded that a commendation should be filed. The form was 17 pages. Page 4 asked him to rate his new team members' interspecies cultural accommodation index on a scale of 1 to 10 with a brief explanatory note. Page 9 contained a section titled Non-Standard Physiological Work Modifications, which included a checkbox grid of accommodations the station could theoretically provide, and a free text field for anything not covered by the grid. Page 12 required the signature of the Divisional Oversight Coordinator, a position that had been vacant for 8 months and whose digital signature still auto-populated on documents, because removing it required a departmental authorization that required the signature of the Divisional Oversight Coordinator. Davin filled out the form the way he completed all administrative requirements, thoroughly on the questions that mattered, and with increasing creative honesty on the questions that didn't. For the Cultural Accommodation Index, he wrote 7, and noted that this number reflected the average quality of the division's coffee, which he felt was the most meaningful environmental variable. For the Physiological Modifications field, he wrote that he had not identified any modifications required, and that she seemed fine, which was accurate, and submitted it before reading page 14, which asked him to confirm that he had read and understood the Class 7 Administrative Privacy Addendum attached to his new team member's personnel file. He had not read it. There was no attachment. The form confirmed receipt of his submission and informed him that a review process had been initiated, which generated a flag in a subsystem 3 levels below the administrative interface, which routed an alert to an inbox maintained by the Station Security Coordination Office, which was being monitored by an officer on rotation who was currently on medical hold, whose alerts were forwarding to a secondary inbox that nobody had been assigned to check, where the flag arrived and sat in the particular patient silence of bureaucratic hazard waiting for someone to eventually remember the inbox existed. Sale did not know about the form. She knew about the improved efficiency logs because Davin had told her, in the same straightforward way he told her everything. Here is what happened. Here is what I did. Here is what the data says. And she had understood that he had logged her contributions accurately, because accuracy was simply how he operated, not because he had considered whether doing so might draw attention to a file that was designed not to invite attention. He had not considered this because it had not occurred to him to consider it, because he was not a man who thought in terms of strategic visibility, and this quality, which had initially alarmed her, had over the course of 3 weeks produced something in her that she was monitoring with the careful attention she gave to things she did not yet have a name for. The end-of-week gathering happened in the break room on a Friday. Davin ran it with the low-key dedication of someone who believes that small rituals prevent large erosions. The coffee was terrible. It was always terrible. The station's beverage synthesis unit had been producing coffee at a temperature and consistency that suggested it had learned about coffee from a written description rather than direct experience. Davin had submitted a maintenance request about it 14 months ago. The request was currently at priority 2, which meant it would be addressed before anything classified as non-critical and after everything classified as urgent, and which in practice meant never. Sale came because she had been invited in a way that made not coming feel like a choice she was making rather than a default she was maintaining. She sat at the table. She accepted the coffee, which was bad in a way that briefly and genuinely united the room, the 2 human technicians, Breck, Davin, and Sale herself, in a moment of shared, uncomplicated suffering. She made one small remark about the atmospheric processor, something precise and dry about its meditative hum suggesting it was working through a philosophical position on the nature of optimal performance, and Breck laughed. Not a large laugh. Breck's expressions of amusement were calibrated instruments, but real, a short sound of genuine recognition. Davin looked at her when she made the joke with an expression she was learning to read as simple pleasure, uncomplicated by anything underneath it. At some point in the middle of an argument about recalibration sequences that she only partially followed, Sale realized she had not thought about her brother for 3 hours. She noted this in the internal ledger she kept without deciding to keep. She looked at the table, at the bad coffee, at the argument proceeding with the comfortable energy of people who had disagreed about this before and would again, at Davin listening with the same attention he gave everything, and she filed the 3 hours as data. She was not yet sure what it was data for. She was, she thought, beginning to have a hypothesis. The flag in the unmonitored inbox had been patient for 11 days when someone finally remembered the inbox existed. This was not, as it turned out, because anyone in the Security Coordination Office had become more organized. It was because the officer on medical hold had returned to duty, discovered that 11 days of alerts had been quietly accumulating in a secondary account, and spent a morning working through them with the resigned efficiency of someone who has learned that bureaucratic systems do not pause in your absence, but do have the decency to pile neatly. Most of the alerts were routine. One was not. Officer Peller read it twice, cross-referenced it with 3 other files, and scheduled a visit to the Environmental Integration Division for the following afternoon, which he noted in his calendar with the particular care of someone who wanted a record of having approached a thing correctly. Davin was reviewing the searing atmospheric data when Peller arrived, which meant he was in exactly the focused, data-proximate state in which he was least equipped to process administrative complexity. He looked up, registered a station security uniform, noted the expression of someone who was professionally neutral about something specific, and offered coffee before he said anything else, because this was simply what Davin did when someone entered his workspace, and he had not yet identified a reason not to. Peller accepted the coffee with the expression of a man who had made a tactical error he could not now reverse. He took one sip. He set it down with great deliberateness and did not touch it again. He asked his questions with the careful neutrality of someone who had done this before. How long had Sale been with the division? What her duties had been? Whether her performance had given cause for concern? Davin answered all of these accurately and without hesitation, because he had no reason for hesitation, which was itself information that Peller was filing. The way Davin spoke about her work, the hydroponic cross-reference, the atmospheric calibration, the quality of her thinking in team discussion, was not the description of a supervisor accounting for a resource. It was the description of someone who had been paying attention to a person. Peller, who had interviewed many supervisors about many allocated staff members, noted the difference and what it implied. Then he asked whether Davin was aware that his team member's file contained several restricted fields under Class 7 privacy protocol. Davin said he had seen the redacted sections. Yes. He said this the way he said everything, directly, without performing innocence, because he simply was innocent. He said that he had not investigated the restrictions because the question of what her file contained had seemed less relevant to the work than the question of what she could actually do, and that the work had answered the second question satisfactorily. Peller looked at him for a moment. It was the look of a man encountering a form of reasoning that was not naive and was not strategic and was not quite like anything his professional experience had prepared a category for. He thanked Davin for his time. He picked up the coffee, appeared to reconsider, set it down again, and left. Sale knew before Davin told her. She had known since 14. 0, when the lighting in the administrative corridor had carried a different quality and Breck had passed her station, moving at a pace that broke his usual rhythm by a margin no human would have caught. She spent the afternoon with the calibration logs, working steadily, her skin held at the careful neutral she had maintained for 3 years, while underneath it something moved that was not quite fear and not quite its opposite. Davin found her in Bay 7 at end of shift. He told her simply a security officer had come, had asked about her work, had asked about her file. He told her what he had said. He did not perform the telling. He did not make it larger than it was or smaller. He said it the way the atmospheric processors reported their data, factually and without editorializing. And then he said the other thing, the thing the chapter had been assembling itself around since its first sentence. He said he didn't know what was in the parts of her file he couldn't read. He said he didn't need to know. He said that if there was anything she thought he should understand, not for the administrative record, not for any reason except that it might matter for how he did right by her, he was available to hear it. The Bay 7 panel displayed its carbon dioxide readings in its customary emphatic font. The atmospheric processor ran its low, considering hum through the walls. Somewhere in the station's administrative network, the flag in Peller's newly monitored inbox sat updated, reviewed, and reclassified as pending further assessment, which was the security system's way of pausing at a threshold and deciding what kind of situation it was actually in. Sale looked at Davin for a long moment. Her skin moved amber, unheld, real, and she did not pull it back. She told him, not everything, not the architecture of it in full, not the specific political geography of what had happened to her family, and why, not her brother's name or where she had last known him to be, because some things remained too carefully interior to release all at once. But enough. Enough for Davin to understand that her name had once come with other names attached to it, that her knowledge of environmental systems was not the patchwork of someone shuffled between departments, but the education of someone who had been intended for a different kind of work before intention had been taken out of the equation, that the reason her file had been trimmed rather than simply sparse was that someone had decided visibility was a form of danger for her, and that she had agreed with this reasoning because she had not, until recently, encountered an environment in which visibility felt like anything other than risk. Davin was quiet when she finished. He was not quiet in the way of someone processing strategy. He was quiet in the way of someone absorbing something that mattered. Then he said he was glad she'd told him. Not glad in the sense of information received. Glad in the sense of someone who understood what the telling had cost and what it meant that she had done it anyway. Breck, who had not left the workspace when he should have, and had positioned himself near the thermal relay panel, with the demeanor of someone absorbed in calibration work, registered a temperature shift in his exoskeleton that his species cataloged as the equivalent of deep and complicated relief. He had been running the longer calculation for 3 weeks. He had arrived at a conclusion he trusted, but had been waiting for the evidence to confirm. He updated the final column in his model, labeled it with a word he had found in a human linguistic database that translated imprecisely but adequately as recognized, and closed the file. The station's night cycle began. The corridor lights shifted from amber to blue. The long exhale of the simulated dark settling through Helix Corridor Station, the way it settled every night, over the administrative offices where Peller had written his pending assessment and gone home, over the break room where the beverage synthesizer was already preparing tomorrow's coffee with its characteristic confident incorrectness, over the hydroponic bays where Bay 7's irrigation matrix ran at its corrected calibration, steady and untroubled, tended properly at last. In Bay 7, Davin looked at the emphatic carbon dioxide reading on the panel and said that he was going to submit another maintenance request about the font in the morning. Sale looked at the panel. She said that the font had a point, actually, that if you were going to tell someone something important you might as well commit to it. Davin considered this. He said that was a reasonable philosophy. The amber moved through her skin, warm and unhurried, and this time it stayed. Not the careful neutral she had arrived with, not the controlled surface she had maintained through 3 years of deliberate invisibility. Something else, something that did not have a name yet in the accounting she kept, but that registered clearly as a beginning, which was, she had come to understand exactly what beginnings felt like. Not like arrival, but like the first moment you believed the floor would hold.